Rome didn't fall to barbarians. Not really. By the time the Germanic tribes sacked the city in 410 AD, Rome had already destroyed itself. The legions were hollowed out. The provinces were in revolt. The economy had collapsed into chaos. And at the heart of it all, quietly, invisibly, catastrophically, was money. Or rather, what Rome did to its money. This is the story of how the greatest empire in human history committed slow-motion suicide through monetary manipulation. How emperors discovered they could fund wars, buy loyalty, and maintain power by debasing their currency. How a trick that seemed brilliant in the short term became a poison that killed Rome from within. And how every lesson Rome learned the hard way. Every mistake, every miscalculation, every desperate attempt to solve problems by destroying the value of money is being repeated today, because Rome's collapse wasn't caused by moral decay or military defeat. It was caused by economics, by inflation, by the slow, grinding destruction of the monetary system that held the empire together. And if you understand how money destroyed Rome, you'll understand the hidden fragility of every monetary system that's come since. Let's go back to the beginning, to when Roman money actually meant something. In the early days of the Republic, the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, Rome's currency was simple and honest. The denarius was a silver coin weighing about 4.5 grams, nearly pure silver. You could hold it, test it, trust it, and trust was everything. Roman money worked because people believed in it. Because when a merchant in Alexandria accepted a Roman denarius, they knew that coin would be accepted in turn by someone in Gaul or Britannia or Hispania. The currency unified an empire sprawling across 3 continents. But more than that, the denarius was backed by something real, by silver mines in Spain, by conquest and plunder, by the productive capacity of an empire that controlled the known world's richest territories. Roman money had value because Rome had power, and Rome had power because its money had value. The two reinforced each other in a stable cycle. For centuries, this system held. The denarius remained reliable, trade flourished. Rome grew wealthy not just from conquest but from commerce. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, was built as much on stable currency as on military might. But empires, like all human institutions, contained the seeds of their own destruction. And for Rome, those seeds were planted in its currency. The problem began with war. It always begins with war. By the 3rd century AD, Rome was fighting on every frontier. Germanic tribes pressed from the north. Persians attacked from the east. Internal rebellions erupted constantly. The empire was overstretched, overcommitted, bleeding resources from 1,000 wounds. War is expensive. Soldiers demand pay. Equipment must be manufactured. Supplies must be transported. Fortifications must be built and maintained. And Rome's traditional sources of revenue, taxation and plunder from new conquests, were drying up. There were no more rich kingdoms to conquer. The frontiers had reached their natural limits, and the provinces that Rome already controlled were being taxed to breaking point. Push any harder and they'd revolt. The emperors faced an impossible choice: cut military spending and watch the empire crumble, or find new revenue somehow. They chose a third option, one that seemed brilliant at the time. They decided to debase the currency. Here's how the trick worked. Remember, the denarius was supposed to be silver. But what if you melted down the old coins, mixed the silver with cheaper metals like copper or tin, and minted new coins that looked almost identical, same size, same weight, same imperial stamp declaring them to be 1 denarius. But inside, less silver, sometimes much less. The emperor could take 100 old denarii, melt them down, add cheap base metals, and mint 120 new denarii, or 150, or 200. He'd just created money, seemingly from nothing. And with those new coins, he could pay his soldiers, fund his wars, buy the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, maintain the appearance of solvency. It was magical. Until it wasn't. The debasement started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Under Emperor Nero in the 60s AD, the denarius was reduced from about 95% pure silver to 90%. A small change, barely noticeable. The empire needed funds for Nero's lavish building projects and military campaigns. 5% less silver seemed a small price to pay. And initially it worked. The new coins circulated. People accepted them. The economy continued functioning. But here's the thing about debasement, it's addictive. Once you start, it's almost impossible to stop. The next emperor faced the same pressures. More wars, more expenses, more demands. And there was the solution, already proven. Just reduce the silver content a little more. Under Trajan, the denarius dropped to about 85% silver. Under Marcus Aurelius, it fell to 75%. Each emperor needed money. Each emperor used the same trick. Each time, the coin became a little less valuable. By the reign of Septimius Severus around 200 AD, the denarius was barely 50% silver. Half real value, half lie. And by the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire was collapsing into chaos, the denarius was essentially worthless. Under Emperor Gallienus in the 260s AD, the coin contained less than 5% silver. It was a copper coin with a thin silver wash on the outside, a fraud wrapped in imperial authority. Rome had discovered that money could be created through debasement. But it was about to learn that value cannot. Because while emperors could control what coins look like, they couldn't control what people believed about them. Merchants weren't stupid. They could weigh coins, test their purity, compare old coins to new ones, and they quickly realized that new denarii contained far less silver than old ones. So they did the rational thing. They raised prices. If a coin now contained half the silver it used to, merchants simply charged twice as many coins for the same goods. If it contained a quarter of the silver, they charged 4 times as much. This is inflation. Not rising prices, that's the symptom. Inflation is the expansion of the money supply without corresponding increase in real wealth, and Rome was inflating catastrophically. A measure of wheat that cost 8 denarii in 200 AD cost 120,000 denarii by 301 AD. Prices increased 15,000 times in just 1 century. Soldiers' wages, which seemed generous when paid in silver coins, became worthless when paid in debased copper. The legions that had conquered the world could no longer afford to feed themselves with their official pay. The government's solution: debase the currency more, print more coins, pay the soldiers with greater quantities of increasingly worthless money. But you can't solve inflation by causing more inflation. You can only accelerate the spiral downward. The economic collapse rippled through every layer of society. The middle class, merchants, artisans, professionals, were annihilated. Their savings, accumulated over lifetimes, became worthless. A pottery workshop that had operated for generations suddenly couldn't afford raw materials. A merchant's inventory was worth less each day he held it. Rational people stopped saving money. Why save when currency loses value daily? They spent immediately or converted money into physical goods that held value. Long-distance trade collapsed. Why ship goods across the empire if the money you'd be paid on arrival would be worth less than the shipping cost? Better to trade locally, or not at all. Tax collection became impossible. Farmers were assessed taxes in denarii, but by the time tax collectors arrived, the currency had depreciated so much that the nominal tax was meaningless. The government tried collecting taxes in kind, grain, animals, goods, but this was inefficient and easily corrupted. The government workforce, bureaucrats, engineers, teachers quit. Why work for wages that couldn't buy food? Better to join the army, where at least you might loot something valuable, or flee to the countryside and try to farm. Cities depopulated. Rome itself, which had peaked at perhaps 1 million inhabitants, shrank to perhaps 50,000 by the 6th century. People fled urban areas where the monetary economy had ceased functioning and retreated to rural estates where at least food could be grown. The empire was transforming, regressing, moving backward from a sophisticated monetary economy toward feudalism and subsistence agriculture. All because the money had died. But the emperors didn't see it this way, or if they did, they had no idea how to stop. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian tried to solve the inflation crisis with an edict on maximum prices. He decreed maximum legal prices for thousands of goods and services. Anyone charging more would be executed. It failed spectacularly. You can't legislate away economic reality. Merchants simply stopped selling goods at the legal prices, creating massive shortages. Black markets flourished. The edict was abandoned within a few years. Diocletian also tried reforming the currency, introducing new coins. But without stopping the debasement, without restoring real value, the new coins just followed the old ones into worthless oblivion. Emperor Constantine later tried again, introducing the solidus, a gold coin that actually contained gold and held its value. But by then, the damage was done. The solidus was used for large transactions and international trade, but ordinary Romans never saw one. The daily economy still ran on nearly worthless copper coins. The empire had bifurcated into two economies: a gold-based system for the wealthy and powerful, and a collapsed, debased system for everyone else. This is what monetary destruction looks like in its final stages. The elites preserve their wealth through hard assets and precious metals. The masses drown in worthless currency. Inequality explodes. Social cohesion disintegrates, and the empire fractures. Let's be clear about causation. Rome faced many problems: barbarian invasions, political instability, plague, overextension, but monetary collapse made all of these worse. How do you pay soldiers to defend the frontiers when money is worthless? You can't. So soldiers desert or switch sides or become bandits themselves. How do you maintain roads, aqueducts, ports, and infrastructure when tax revenue collapses? You don't. So trade becomes harder, cities decline, and the economy contracts further. How do you hold together a vast multicultural empire when the currency that facilitated exchange and unified markets has become worthless? You can't. So provinces break away, local strongmen seize power, and the empire fragments. The Visigoths who sacked Rome in 410 AD weren't facing a military superpower. They were facing a hollowed-out shell of an empire that had already collapsed economically decades earlier. Rome didn't fall to the barbarians. Rome fell to its own economic mismanagement. The barbarians just pushed over a structure that was already crumbling from within. Now, let's talk about today, because the parallels are uncomfortably precise. Modern governments face the same pressures Rome did: wars, social programs, infrastructure, debt, and revenues that never quite cover expenses. And modern governments have discovered the same solution Rome did: monetary expansion. We don't call it debasement anymore. We call it quantitative easing, monetary stimulus, expanding the money supply. The language is technical and sanitized, but the mechanism is identical. When the Federal Reserve creates trillions of dollars through digital money creation, when the European Central Bank expands its balance sheet, when governments worldwide printed unprecedented amounts of currency during the COVID pandemic, they're doing exactly what Roman emperors did: creating money without creating corresponding real wealth. We're more sophisticated about it. We use central banks and complex financial instruments instead of melting down coins. We measure M2 money supply instead of silver content. But the fundamental process is the same, and the fundamental result will likely be the same too. Since 1971, when the US dollar was completely separated from gold, the money supply has exploded. The purchasing power of the dollar has declined by over 85%. What cost $1 in 1971 costs over $6 today. This is debasement, slower than Rome's final century, but the same process. The same transfer of wealth from savers to debtors, from workers to asset owners, from the productive economy to the financial sector. And like Rome, we tell ourselves this time is different. Our economists are smarter. Our institutions are stronger. Our technology is better. Maybe. Or maybe every civilization that debases its currency believes the same thing right up until the moment it doesn't work anymore. Here's what Rome teaches us. Monetary debasement is a trap that's easy to enter and nearly impossible to escape. The first debasement seems harmless: a small reduction in silver content to pay for necessary expenses. A reasonable response to difficult circumstances, but it sets a precedent. The next emperor faces the same pressures and uses the same tool, and the next, and the next. Each step seems rational in isolation, but collectively they form a death spiral, because each debasement causes inflation, which creates more economic problems, which create pressure for more debasement. Once you start, stopping means accepting painful consequences. Economic contraction, inability to fund government operations, social unrest, possible collapse. No emperor wanted to be the one who stopped debasing currency and watched the empire crumble on his watch. Better to keep the game going and let the next guy deal with the consequences. This is called the temporal trap. The benefits of monetary expansion are immediate and obvious. The costs are delayed and diffuse. So every leader chooses short-term gain over long-term stability, until eventually there's no more long-term, only crisis. Rome's story isn't just history, it's a warning. Every fiat currency in history has eventually failed. Every government that gained the power to create money at will has eventually abused that power. Every empire that tried to fund itself through monetary debasement has collapsed. The Roman denarius lasted from 211 BC to about 300 AD before becoming worthless, roughly 500 years. An impressive run, but it still ended. The question isn't whether fiat currencies fail. History answers that clearly. They do. Always. The question is whether our currencies will be the exception, whether our institutions are strong enough, our understanding deep enough, Our discipline sufficient to avoid the trap that's caught every civilization before us. Maybe we are different. Maybe this time truly is different. But Rome thought it was eternal too. And Rome was wrong. So, what do you do with this knowledge? You recognize that currency is not wealth. It's a claim on wealth. A useful tool when it functions, but fundamentally fragile. You understand that governments face enormous pressure to debase currency, and that pressure increases during crises. Every war, pandemic, recession, or emergency creates demands for spending that exceed revenue. You diversify beyond currency into assets that can't be inflated away. Land, commodities, productive businesses, skills, things that have value independent of any government's promise. You study history, not because the past repeats exactly, but because human nature doesn't change. The pressures Roman emperors faced are the same pressures modern governments face. The temptations are identical, and the consequences will likely be similar. And perhaps most importantly, you maintain perspective. Empires rise and fall, currencies come and go, but human civilization continues. The collapse of Rome was catastrophic for Romans, but life went on, different systems emerged. Eventually, new prosperity arose. The monetary system is not civilization itself, it's just the current arrangement. And when arrangements fail, as they inevitably do, humans adapt. The question is whether you'll be prepared when it happens. Rome was the greatest empire the ancient world ever knew. It conquered nations, built monuments that still stand today, created legal and political systems that influenced all of Western civilization. But it couldn't solve the fundamental problem of fiat currency. It couldn't resist the temptation to create money without creating value. It couldn't escape the trap of monetary debasement. And so Rome fell, not to external enemies but to internal contradictions, not to military defeat but to economic suicide. The legions that conquered the world were destroyed by the same government that employed them. The economy that built aqueducts and roads collapsed under the weight of worthless currency. The empire that seemed eternal crumbled into futile fragments. All because of money, or rather, because of what Rome did to its money. The lesson is carved into history, written in the ruins of the Forum and the empty spaces where great cities once stood. You cannot create value by debasing currency. You cannot fund empire by destroying the monetary system that makes empire possible. Rome learned this lesson too late. The question is whether we'll learn it in time. History doesn't repeat. It reveals. And what it reveals again and again is this: the money always dies before the empire does. The currency collapses before the cities fall. Rome destroyed its own money, and in doing so, it destroyed itself. Choose what you trust carefully, because Rome's citizens trusted their government's money right up until the moment it became worthless. And by then, it was far too late.